The atheist lecturer thought he could dismiss faith with a single question. He never expected one Muslim student to dismantle his entire argument in front of everyone. The lecture hall was silent. Hundreds of students watched as the well-known atheist lecturer stood confidently at the front, pacing slowly, smirking slightly. He loved these moments. "Let me ask all of you something," he began, voice steady and sharp. "Where is God? Can anyone here show me proof?" He paused, scanning the room. Science measures everything. We can see atoms, galaxies, DNA, but God? No evidence, no measurement, just belief. A few students chuckled quietly. Others avoided his gaze, not daring to speak. It was the same every time. No one had an answer. But today, one hand quietly went up. A Muslim student, calm and collected, stood from his seat. The lecturer raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go ahead," he said. The student smiled politely. "Sir, may I ask you a question first?" "Of course," the lecturer replied, curious. The student asked, "Do you believe in your own thoughts?" The lecturer looked slightly puzzled but nodded. "Obviously, thoughts exist." The student continued, "Can you show them to us? Can we see them? Touch them? Put them under a microscope?" The room went quiet. The student's voice remained steady. "We can't see thoughts directly, but we know they exist because of their effects, words, actions, ideas. Just because something isn't visible doesn't mean it isn't real." He paused, then added, "God is like that. You may not see him physically, but his signs, order, life, purpose are everywhere. Just like thoughts, they're not seen, but deeply felt." The lecturer didn't reply immediately. His usual smirk faded, replaced by a thoughtful stare. The room stayed silent. The student sat down. No argument, no debate, just one simple, profound answer. That day, no one laughed. Everyone left with something to think about. The room stayed silent for a moment after the Muslim student finished his point. But Dr. Harris, known for never backing down easily, straightened up and responded, his tone still polite but firm. "That's an interesting comparison," the lecturer began. "But love is something we can observe indirectly. Science can study how love affects the brain, the chemicals it releases, the behaviors it produces. It's explainable. But when you talk about love, you're asking us to believe in something without clear, measurable evidence." The student nodded respectfully. "I understand, sir," he replied calmly. "But let me ask, why do we trust indirect evidence in some cases and reject it in others? You mentioned brain chemicals when discussing love. But would you say those chemicals alone fully explain what love is? Or do they just describe part of what's happening without capturing the experience itself?" The lecturer hesitated slightly, but replied, "Science explains the mechanisms. That's enough. We don't need to look beyond what we can measure." The student smiled gently. "Science can explain how things work, yes, but not always why they exist in the first place. For example, we can describe how the universe behaves. But why is there something rather than nothing? Why are there laws of physics at all instead of chaos?" Dr. Harris raised his eyebrow. "We don't need to assume a designer just because we don't yet know why. That's the God of the gaps argument. We leave room for discovery." The student nodded again. "But is it really about filling gaps or recognizing patterns and purpose that point beyond randomness? You see, sir, we don't only believe in God because of what science hasn't explained. We believe because the order, harmony, and meaning we see suggests something intentional. Just like when we find a beautifully written book, we don't assume it happened by accident. We look for the author." The lecturer folded his arms. "But the universe is vast, possibly infinite. Can't natural processes account for all of this, given enough time?" The student's tone stayed calm. "Natural processes follow laws. Laws don't write themselves. Processes don't guide themselves. Even if we say the universe runs on its own, the question remains, where did those laws, that order, come from? Is it more logical to say it all came from nothing, or from something with knowledge and will?" Dr. Harris paused. He looked around the room, realizing the students were no longer just watching for entertainment. They were really listening now. The lecturer finally spoke again. "But if God exists, why can't we see him directly? Why stay hidden?" The student responded gently. Maybe because the purpose of life isn't to have everything shown to us immediately, but to seek, to reflect, to choose belief freely. Just like love, you don't demand proof before you trust someone. You recognize it over time, through signs, through sincerity. Faith works the same way. For a moment, the lecturer didn't answer. The room stayed still, the debate no longer feeling like a competition, but something deeper, a conversation about meaning, purpose, and how we understand what's real. Then Dr. Harris gave a small nod, acknowledging the student's point without dismissing it. The lecture moved on, but the discussion hung in the air. No final verdict was declared, but everyone left thinking, questioning, not just what they believed, but why. The lecturer took a breath, adjusting his glasses, clearly not ready to concede. His voice stayed composed, but there was a slight edge now, the kind that comes when a challenge is more real than expected. "All right," Dr. Harris said, "let's assume for a moment that the universe shows signs of order and purpose. But religions don't just stop there. They make specific claims about God, about his nature, about what he wants, about how humans should live. How can you trust that those claims are true when so many religions contradict each other?" The Muslim student didn't flinch. He nodded thoughtfully, then responded, "That's a fair question, sir, but think of it like this. If multiple people describe the same mountain from different sides, they might focus on different details. Some may have errors, but that doesn't mean the mountain itself isn't real. Islam teaches that God sent guidance to different nations throughout history. Over time, messages can be changed, misunderstood, or lost. The Quran claims to confirm and clarify that guidance, preserving it." He paused, letting that settle. But the real test is not just in claims, it's in the message itself. Does it speak to the heart, to reason? Does it provide consistency, balance, and purpose? Many who read it sincerely find that it does. Dr. Harris tilted his head slightly. But how can you trust a book written centuries ago by people who didn't have the knowledge we have today? The student smiled faintly, answering calmly, "Truth isn't limited by time, sir. We value ancient wisdom in philosophy, ethics, even science. The question is, does that wisdom still hold up?" The Quran invites people to think, to observe, to ask questions. It emphasizes knowledge and reflection. That's why, even centuries later, it resonates with those who approach it openly. Dr. Harris leaned forward slightly. "But surely you can't deny the progress humanity has made by questioning old ideas. Science has corrected so much of what people used to believe." The student nodded. "Absolutely. Questioning is vital. Islam doesn't discourage questioning. In fact, it encourages it. But progress doesn't mean rejecting all foundations. Science tells us the how. Faith tells us the why. They answer different questions. We use both to build a complete understanding." The lecturer sat back for a moment, absorbing that. Around the room, students watched quietly, eyes moving between the lecturer and the student, aware now that this wasn't an ordinary lecture. Something more was happening. Finally, Dr. Harris spoke again, voice more thoughtful now. "Fine. Let's set aside the science for a moment. Even if we say God exists, how do you reconcile the suffering, the injustice in the world, with the idea of an all-powerful, all-good creator?" A murmur rippled through the students. It was the question many wanted to hear answered. The student took a breath, his expression calm but serious. "That's something people have asked for centuries," he said quietly. "Islam teaches that life is a test. Suffering, hardship, injustice, they're part of that test. But they're not meaningless. They shape us, reveal character, teach empathy, and they're temporary. This life isn't the end. It's preparation for something beyond it." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of several students. "We judge fairness based on our limited view, but God sees the entire picture. Sometimes what seems like suffering is the very thing that wakes us up, makes us stronger, connects us to others, reminds us of what really matters." The lecturer looked at him steadily, and for the first time there was no trace of the earlier smirk or superiority. He nodded slightly, acknowledging this sincerity, even if he wasn't ready to fully agree. The student ended softly, "You asked, where is God? Look at the universe, look at your own heart, your conscience, your ability to question, to reflect, to care. Those are signs. Maybe God is waiting for us to stop looking outward and start looking inward. The room stayed quiet. Dr. Harris sat still, clearly reflecting. And though he didn't offer a reply, something had shifted, not just in him, but in everyone listening. Because sometimes it's not about winning a debate, it's about planting a seed. The lecturer took a breath, adjusting his glasses, clearly not ready to concede. His voice stayed composed, but there was a slight edge now, the kind that comes when a challenge is more real than expected. "All right," Dr. Harris said, "let's assume for a moment that the universe shows signs of order and purpose. But religions don't just stop there. They make specific claims about God, about his nature, about what he wants, about how humans should live. How can you trust that those claims are true when so many religions contradict each other?" The Muslim student didn't flinch. He nodded thoughtfully, then responded, "That's a fair question, sir, but think of it like this. If multiple people describe the same mountain from different sides, they might focus on different details. Some may have errors, but that doesn't mean the mountain itself isn't real. Islam teaches that God sent guidance to different nations throughout history. Over time, messages can be changed, misunderstood, or lost. The Quran claims to confirm and clarify that guidance, preserving it." He paused, letting that settle. But the real test is not just in claims, it's in the message itself. Does it speak to the heart, to reason? Does it provide consistency, balance, and purpose? Many who read it sincerely find that it does. Dr. Harris tilted his head slightly. "But how can you trust a book written centuries ago by people who didn't have the knowledge we have today?" The student smiled faintly, answering calmly, "Truth isn't limited by time, sir. We value ancient wisdom in philosophy, ethics, even science. The question is, does that wisdom still hold up?" The Quran invites people to think, to observe, to ask questions. It emphasizes knowledge and reflection. That's why, even centuries later, it resonates with those who approach it openly. Dr. Harris leaned forward slightly. "But surely you can't deny the progress humanity has made by questioning old ideas. Science has corrected so much of what people used to believe." The student nodded. "Absolutely. Questioning is vital. Islam doesn't discourage questioning. In fact, it encourages it. But progress doesn't mean rejecting all foundations. Science tells us the how. Faith tells us the why. They answer different questions. We use both to build a complete understanding." The lecturer sat back for a moment, absorbing that. Around the room, students watched quietly, eyes moving between the lecturer and the student, aware now that this wasn't an ordinary lecture. Something more was happening. Finally, Dr. Harris spoke again, voice more thoughtful now. "Fine, let's set aside the science for a moment. Even if we say God exists, how do you reconcile the suffering, the injustice in the world, with the idea of an all-powerful, all-good creator?" A murmur rippled through the students. It was the question many wanted to hear answered. The student took a breath, his expression calm but serious. "That's something people have asked for centuries," he said quietly. "Islam teaches that life is a test. Suffering, hardship, injustice, they're part of that test, but they're not meaningless. They shape us, reveal character, teach empathy, and they're temporary. This life isn't the end. It's preparation for something beyond it." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of several students. "We judge fairness based on our limited view, but God sees the entire picture. Sometimes what seems like suffering is the very thing that wakes us up, makes us stronger, connects us to others, reminds us of what really matters." The lecturer looked at him steadily, and for the first time there was no trace of the earlier smirk or superiority. He nodded slightly, acknowledging the sincerity, even if he wasn't ready to fully agree. The student ended softly. "You asked, where is God? Look at the universe. Look at your own heart, your conscience, your ability to question, to reflect, to care. Those are signs. Maybe God is waiting for us to stop looking outward and start looking inward." The room stayed quiet. Dr. Harris sat still, clearly reflecting. And though he didn't offer a reply, something had shifted, not just in him, but in everyone listening. Because sometimes it's not about winning a debate, it's about planting a seed. For a moment, Dr. Harris didn't speak. His fingers tapped gently against the edge of the podium, his usual confidence, quieter now, not gone, but thoughtful. The lecture hall remained tense, waiting. Then he finally leaned forward, speaking in a lower, more reflective tone. "You make strong points," he said, his voice measured. "But here's the thing. You talk about purpose-designed tests, but isn't that just comforting? A way to make sense of things that don't make sense? Isn't belief in God just a way to cope with life's uncertainties?" The student nodded, showing no defensiveness. "I understand why you might think that, but comfort alone doesn't make something true. It's not about believing because it's easy or feels good. In fact, real faith often comes with struggle, facing questions, facing doubt, facing hardship. But we believe not because it's comforting, but because when we look at reality, the complexity of life, the order of the universe, the moral compass inside us, it all points beyond itself. Faith isn't escapism, it's facing those questions honestly, and finding the answer isn't emptiness, but meaning." He paused, locking eyes with the lecturer. "Besides, sir, I'd argue something else. Maybe disbelief is also a way to find comfort. Comfort in thinking we owe nothing to anyone beyond ourselves. No accountability, no higher purpose, no responsibility beyond this life." A hush fell over the room. That hit deeper than expected. Dr. Harris's expression shifted slightly, more guarded now, but intrigued. "So you're saying belief is about accountability, not comfort?" The student nodded gently. "Yes, accountability, purpose, connection. And ultimately freedom, not freedom to do anything without consequence, but freedom from being lost, freedom from thinking life is random and meaningless. Islam teaches that we were created with a purpose, and understanding that frees us." The lecturer stood still, clearly weighing that, but he wasn't finished. He asked one more question, voice softer but sharp. "If God wants us to believe, why not make his existence undeniable? Why the hiddenness?" The student's reply was immediate but calm. "Because real belief isn't forced, it's chosen. If God appeared before us right now, no one could deny him. But that wouldn't be belief. It would be submission out of sheer power. Faith is meant to be sincere, not coerced. The signs are there, but it's up to us to see them." He paused, then added, "If we recognize the signs, whether in the universe, in ourselves, or in the wisdom of revelation, it's an invitation to reflect, not a demand. That's what makes belief meaningful." The lecturer stood silently, eyes flickering, not with the certainty he usually carried, but something deeper. Reflection, maybe even respect. The room remained still, the tension now replaced with something quieter. The back and forth had ended not with a winner, not with applause, but with something far more lasting. A pause. A moment where both sides stood not as opponents, but as thinkers, as searchers. Finally, Dr. Harris gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the sincerity without needing to offer rebuttal. The lecture moved on, but everyone knew, no matter what came next, no one would forget what they had just witnessed. Because sometimes debates don't end with a knockout. Sometimes they end with a seed quietly planted, left to grow long after the words have faded. The lecturer stood still, eyes on the student, clearly turning things over in his mind. The students, who had been waiting for a sharp conclusion or a verbal takedown, realized something unusual was happening. There was no winner or loser. There was something more human, more real. Two people exchanging ideas, without hostility, without arrogance. Dr. Harris finally spoke again, but his tone was noticeably softer now. "All right," he said, "let me admit something. I've spent years arguing these points. I've seen people cling to beliefs that contradict each other. I've seen religion used to justify terrible things. That's part of why I've always challenged it. Don't you think belief can divide people too?" The student took a breath. He understood the weight behind that question. His reply wasn't rushed. "Yes," he said honestly, "belief can be misused. Anything powerful can be. But the problem isn't belief itself, it's how people handle it. The same way knowledge can be used for good or harm, or how freedom can uplift or destroy." He looked directly at the lecturer, no defensiveness, just sincerity. "Islam teaches that belief should never be about control or pride. It should humble you, make you more just, more compassionate, True faith isn't meant to divide, it's meant to guide, to unite people in values like mercy, justice, patience. There was a pause. The lecturer listened, arms folded, no sign of mockery, just focus. Then he pressed further. But if belief is meant to unite, why so many different religions? Why not one clear message for everyone? The student smiled faintly, clearly ready. God's message has always been one, he said. Believe in one God, live justly, treat others well. That's the core, repeated throughout history. But people change, forget, divide. The Quran calls itself a confirmation, a reminder of the same truth, and it acknowledges others who received guidance before. The division isn't because of God, it's because of human beings. The lecturer nodded slightly, processing. He asked one final question, his voice quieter, less challenging now, more personal. But how do you know, really know, it's true? How do you trust your belief over all the noise? The student's answer came gently, no hesitation. I know because faith doesn't ask me to switch off my reason. It asks me to use it, to reflect, to question, to seek. I read the Quran, I observe the world, I examine myself. Everything lines up. It's not blind belief, it's clarity. He paused, then added, voice steady. And when I live by it, it brings peace, purpose, discipline, not because life is always easy, but because I know why I'm here. That's not noise, that's something real. The room stayed quiet. The debate was done, but no one had expected it to end like this. There was no raised voice, no final blow. Just two people exchanging thoughts in a room full of students who wouldn't forget how it made them feel. Like the real debate wasn't about winning, but about understanding something deeper. Dr. Harris glanced once more at the student. Then, with a small nod, one of respect, maybe even acknowledgement, he moved on to close the lecture. But every person in that room knew that conversation would stay with them long after they walked out. Dr. Harris adjusted his glasses again, glancing briefly at his notes. But it was clear to everyone in the room that the conversation had drifted far from his prepared lecture. For a few moments he remained silent, as if weighing whether to continue. Then, as if deciding he had nothing to lose, he looked back up at the Muslim student. You speak calmly, Dr. Harris said, voice measured, and I'll admit, your answers are well thought out. But let me ask you something more personal. Have you ever doubted? He leaned forward slightly. I mean, really doubted everything you believe? The room stirred slightly. The question felt sharp, not because it was hostile, but because it cut straight to the heart of things. The student met his gaze without flinching. He nodded once. Yes, he replied simply. Of course I have. A murmur moved quietly through the students. Dr. Harris seemed slightly surprised, but intrigued. Faith, the student continued, isn't about never questioning. It's about what you do when the questions come. I've doubted, I've asked, I've struggled, but I didn't stop there. I sought answers. And every time I found the same thing, the more I questioned, the more clarity I found. The Quran itself encourages reflection, invites doubt to be met with thought, not suppression. He paused briefly, letting his words sink in, then added, doubt is not the enemy of faith. Complacency is. Dr. Harris nodded slowly, clearly considering. But aren't you worried, the lecturer pressed on, that by believing in God, by believing in a higher purpose, you're placing your trust in something you can never truly verify? Something that might just be a comforting illusion. The student smiled faintly, thoughtful, never defensive. I understand that concern, he said, but let me ask, how do you live without belief? How do you trust that life has meaning if everything is random, temporary, and ends in nothing? Dr. Harris tilted his head, but didn't interrupt. We all live by beliefs, the student continued. You believe in certain values, in human rights, in justice. Can you see those values physically? Can you measure them in a lab? No, but you trust them because you feel their truth, because they shape the world in meaningful ways. He paused and added gently, my belief in God is the same. It isn't blind. It's based on reflection, reason, experience. It's tested by life, and every time it holds up. Dr. Harris stood quietly, clearly turning the words over in his mind. You could see it. He was no longer preparing to refute. He was processing, thinking. One student in the back shifted in their seat as if sensing the entire room had shifted too. The usual dynamic, lecturer in control, audience quietly observing, had changed. Now everyone could feel they were part of something different. Dr. Harris looked down for a moment, then spoke one more time. "I'll admit," he said slowly, "I've debated a lot of believers. Most try to argue me into a corner. You didn't do that." The Muslim student simply nodded. "I'm not here to win a debate," he replied quietly. "I'm here to share something that gives me purpose. Something that's grounded me through every question, every doubt, every hardship." Dr. Harris gave a small, almost reluctant smile. "Well, you've certainly given us all something to think about." With that, he glanced around the hall, knowing the students weren't just watching, they were thinking deeply, possibly in a way they hadn't before. The debate wasn't settled. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the most powerful conversations don't end with applause or a winner. They end when the room falls silent and everyone walks away quietly reflecting. The lecture hall, once charged with a mix of tension, curiosity, and even a bit of playful arrogance, now felt remarkably different. The energy that had been buzzing at the start, when Dr. Harris stood confidently questioning the existence of God, had shifted entirely. As the last words of the Muslim student echoed in the minds of everyone present, it became clear that something meaningful had just unfolded. Students who earlier leaned forward eagerly, waiting to be entertained by another sharp-tongued takedown, now sat quietly, eyes distant, lost in thought. Those who had smirked or exchanged knowing glances when the lecturer posed his usual challenge, "Where is Guama?" were no longer grinning. They looked subdued, reflective, even a little unsure. Something real had settled over them, something they hadn't quite expected when they walked into that lecture hall. You could feel it in the way students shuffled slowly as they gathered their belongings, no longer rushing to leave, no longer eager to chat about the lecturer's clever points. Instead, their movements were measured, almost hesitant, as if they were still replaying the conversation in their minds, unsure how to process what they just witnessed. It wasn't loud and it wasn't dramatic, but the silence spoke volumes. Some students glanced at each other, but not with the same smugness or amusement as before. Now their looks seemed to say something else entirely, something like, "Did you feel that too?" It was an unspoken acknowledgement that they had just seen something genuine, something that made them pause. Even the students who hadn't been particularly interested in the debate found themselves wondering why they couldn't quite shake the students' words from their thoughts. A few lingered longer than usual, not in any rush to leave. They stood in small groups, talking quietly, their voices low, their faces serious. Some glanced back at the seat where the Muslim student had been sitting, almost as if expecting him to still be there, quietly answering questions. Others walked out into the hallway, but their expressions revealed they were carrying something with them, something that had settled deep in their minds, refusing to let go easily. The lecturer himself moved slower, packing up his notes without the usual brisk confidence. He glanced briefly at the rows of seats, his eyes lingering on the spot where the student had stood. For once, there was no hint of victory in his expression, no trace of the satisfaction he usually carried after these debates. Instead, he looked thoughtful, maybe even a bit unsettled. Perhaps, like the students, he was still processing. Perhaps he realized that the dynamic had shifted in a way he hadn't anticipated. The usual post-lecture chatter was noticeably absent. No one was rushing to discuss the finer points of the lecturer's arguments. Instead, conversations were more subdued. Some students walked silently, lost in their own reflections. Others whispered quietly to friends, their voices almost hesitant, as if unsure how to put their thoughts into words. It wasn't the kind of atmosphere that came from shock or confrontation. It was something quieter, deeper, a collective recognition that they had just been part of something meaningful. What made it even more powerful was how unexpected it had been. No one came to the lecture hall that day expecting a profound exchange. They came expecting the usual, a confident lecturer, a few clever quips, a room full of laughter or dismissive nods. But instead they witnessed something rare, A calm, respectful conversation that didn't rely on volume or force, but on clarity and sincerity. And that's what stayed with them. Not the arguments, but the tone. The way one student, without raising his voice or trying to dominate, had shifted the entire room simply by speaking with quiet conviction. The impact of that moment wasn't something you could measure immediately. It wouldn't be reflected in a test score or a debate ranking, but it lingered. It would come back later, maybe when someone was walking home alone, thinking about purpose. Maybe when another student faced their own doubts, wondering where to turn. Maybe when someone remembered that faith doesn't need to shout to be real. That shift wasn't loud, but it was lasting. And everyone who walked out of that room that day carried it with them, whether they realized it yet or not. The lecture hall gradually emptied, students shuffling out in small groups or walking alone, their footsteps softer than usual, their voices quieter. But even as the room emptied, the feeling that had settled over everyone lingered, almost like the air itself carried the weight of what had just happened. It was clear that no one would forget the calm, steady voice of the Muslim student who had stood up and answered without needing to raise his tone, without needing to prove himself through loud words or sharp comebacks. It wasn't about who had the flashiest argument or who could talk the longest. It was about something much deeper, something that stayed long after the debate ended. That's the quiet power of faith. It doesn't need to be loud or aggressive to be strong. It doesn't rely on overpowering others or forcing them to agree. It stands firm, unshaken, not because it silences questions, but because it welcomes them and still stands tall afterward. As the students left, many of them carried that realization with them. Some may not have known how to describe it yet, but they felt it. The way truth doesn't always need to be shouted to be heard. The way real conviction doesn't waver when challenged. And that's what made the moment last. Days later, as students sat in other classes or walked through campus, some of them would find their thoughts drifting back to that lecture hall, to that unexpected exchange. They'd remember how one quiet answer changed the atmosphere. They'd remember how, instead of confrontation, there was calm. Instead of noise, there was reflection. Instead of certainty shaken, there was conviction revealed. And slowly they'd realize something important. That kind of strength stays with you. The lecturer himself felt it too. Even after the lecture ended, even after the students left, he sat at his desk a little longer than usual, eyes fixed on the space where the student had stood. Maybe he had intended to move quickly to the next topic, to wrap up the session neatly, but something about the student's simple, sincere response stayed with him. It wasn't an argument he could easily dismiss. It wasn't a statement meant to score points. It was something deeper, something that touched on questions he'd asked for years, but maybe never paused long enough to really consider. And as he packed up his things, moving more slowly than usual, he knew this wasn't a conversation he'd forget anytime soon. The lasting message wasn't about intellectual victory. It wasn't about changing anyone's mind on the spot. It was about planting something, a question, a thought, a shift in perspective that would quietly keep working long after the room was empty. Faith, real faith, doesn't demand attention. It doesn't need to be flashy or loud. It's steady. It's patient. It's the kind of strength that speaks softly but stays with you, reminding you that some truths don't need to be shouted to be real. They're felt in the stillness, recognized in the silence that follows. And sometimes it's in that quiet space, after all the debates have ended, that people truly begin to reflect. For everyone who sat in that room, whether they realized it in that moment or days later, the impact was clear. The student's calm voice wasn't just an answer to the lecturer's challenge. It was a reminder that belief isn't fragile. It doesn't crumble under pressure. It holds firm because it's built not on loud declarations, but on something deeper. Understanding, reflection, and an unshakable connection to something greater. That's the kind of message that lasts, not because it forces itself on you, but because it quietly stays, waiting for you to notice. And once you do, it's hard to forget. Like, comment, and subscribe for more Muslim stories that matter.